Washington Journal continues.
Joining us now is Chris Farrell. He's with Judicial Watch. He's their Director for Investigations and Research, here to talk about that release of the Inspector General report. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning.
To start with, remind people about the release of the Inspector General report. What was it about, its conclusions, and how much you agreed or disagreed with those conclusions?
Sure. So the Inspector General issued a report on the 14th, last Thursday. The focus of the report had to do with the FBI's handling of the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email server, or her server generally, but in particular the email traffic that went across it, how the investigation was conducted, whether it was proper, complete, accurate, all those sorts of things. And then in the course of their investigation, they uncovered a series of communications, primarily text messages, between FBI officials, both attorneys on the FBI staff and special agents. And the results were pretty shocking. The conclusion the Inspector General came to was that there was clearly some sort of misconduct here. They've made a referral to the Office of Professional Responsibility within the FBI. But they're kind of split. They go on at length. There's dozens of pages discussing these inappropriate or unlawful text messages.
This is between Peter Strzok and Lisa Page.
Correct. Mm-hmm. That demonstrate bias. In fact, on page 398 of the report, there's a big discussion of bias and the appearance of bias, the appearance of improper activity. And so they talk about it a lot, but then they say, well, it didn't really affect anything. And that's kind of where I have a little trouble with how the report came out. But I think you have to contextualize what an Inspector General report is, right? It's not a criminal investigation. An IG looks at a particular department or agency, and they do an investigation like this to analyze violations of policy and procedure. So it's sort of like an in-house policy review. They uncover things that are unlawful or inappropriate, but that's not really what they're being asked to do. They're being asked to examine it from a policy and procedure point of view. And so that's why I think people see this disconnect. They say, well, wait a minute. The things they said, the things they did, that appears to be unlawful, but that's not the lens through which an Inspector General looks at things necessarily. In
a sense, they found several instances, not only with the email, but other things, saying that it might have been the best way of doing things, but there was no malicious undertones to it. I'm paraphrasing, but tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, that is a fair appraisal. I think the other thing that's interesting is to look at the IG spends a substantial amount of time talking about their process. And so they go out of their way to explain where there were options, sort of investigative alternatives. They could, let's say there's 3 courses of action, and the persons involved chose course of action A. They didn't question that decision. They just assumed it was in good faith. They interviewed the persons about that, but there was no sort of 20/20 hindsight. There was no, well, look, we examined it, and we would have chosen course of action C. They don't do that. They just accept it at face value. That's not, again, that isn't a criminal investigation. That's this sort of administrative policy and procedure review. It's distinctly different than a criminal investigation.
So we'll talk about this IG report on Hillary Clinton's email use, and if you want to ask our guests questions about it, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents, 202-748-8002. And you can tweet us at CSPAN WJ. Back to the text exchange. You said you had issues with the conclusions. What are those issues?
Yeah, so on page 398 of the report, the IG discusses 4 different categories of text messages that were exchanged. They're quite explicit in that narrative portion at the bottom of 398, where they say that there is an appearance of impropriety, that there was bias, that decisions and actions were affected by those points of view expressed. But then in the next breath they say, well, it didn't affect the outcome of the investigation. They say that it did on page 398. So if you're going to discuss these 4 categories of text messages and say that there's an appearance of bias and that bias was politically motivated and affected behavior and conduct, well, then there was bias. So there's a few instances like that. I'll give you another example. When you start at about page 395 in the report, there's a discussion for 30 some odd pages of all these text messages. They interviewed the persons who sent them. So Strzok and Page, 3 other characters. There's Agent 1 and Agent 5, and then Attorney 2. I think all those people should be revealed personally. I think that it's fair that the public know who they are. But nonetheless, they go text message by text message and allow those persons to explain what they were thinking, how they felt, what they intended by it. And of course, there's an awful lot of rationalization there. Well, I didn't really mean it. I didn't say it that way. That was just a moment of frustration. I thought I was spouting off to a friend. So they kind of backpedal from what the actual language, and some of the language is really quite reckless. It's pretty offensive stuff. What's particularly curious to me, though, is that on page 409, there's a text message from Lisa Page to Strzok talking about developing briefing points for the director of the FBI. And she says, POTUS, meaning President of the United States, POTUS wants to know everything we're doing. There's no description or rationalization about that particular text message. It's conspicuously absent. I find that interesting. It's because that takes this entire exchange and sort of drags it into the Oval Office. It implicates President Obama. We know that we have McCabe's calendar from May of 2016.
Andrew McCabe, yeah.
Andrew McCabe goes to the White House and briefs Lisa Monaco, President Obama's Homeland Security Director, on these matters. And so there's at least two documented distinct lines that draw this whole controversy into the Obama White House. There's no discussion of it. It is conspicuously absent in the report.
We've got phone calls lined up for you. We'll start with Connecticut, Wallingford, Connecticut, independent line. Andy is on with our guest, Chris Farrell of Judicial Watch. Go ahead.
Hey, Chris. Judicial Watch should Freedom of Information Act the DOJ over the timeline of how Mueller was hired and who at the DOJ and the FBI knew Mueller was in line to be special counsel. Did Comey and Rosenstein discuss that Mueller was lined up to be the special counsel? When Comey was fired and he leaked his memos to the media to get a special counsel, Comey probably already knew that Mueller, his friend and mentor, was already lined up for a special counsel position, which would help Comey defeat President Trump. Your thoughts?
I think the caller has a pretty reasoned approach to this. There's probably a small universe of persons who are kind of on the go-to list for special counsel. Mueller is probably one of those kind of pre-qualified persons because of his background and training and career. That's not a surprise. Another name that was bandied about at the time was Patrick Fitzgerald, another sort of very experienced, credentialed professional prosecutor, DOJ time, FBI time, et cetera. And, you know, it's been discussed that, well, gee, Comey's actions and activities in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee were under oath. He admitted that he had leaked information. You know, that was all sort of a precursor or lining up of the stars to provoke or to initiate a special counsel. And so I don't think that we have documentary proof of that yet, but I think it's not unreasonable to think that that was sort of the way things were going.
Back to the report that was released when it comes to Freedom of Information Act.
Right.
Is Judicial Watch seeking more information about this, or does this report settle it?
Oh, no. There's many Freedom of Information Act or FOIA requests around this report where we're seeking information. In fact, you know, really, the reason why the report was ever written is because of Hillary Clinton's email server decision and her decision to not use State Department communications for her own purposes. And that was revealed or exposed only by Judicial Watch litigation. We had asked questions about Benghazi, believe it or not. And in all the communications around Benghazi, we saw all sorts of traffic to various key figures, persons that you would imagine would have an interest in that tragedy. And conspicuously absent was anything from Mrs. Clinton. And so the case took its course. As many FOIA cases are, it was dismissed because you get what you get and then you're done. And then about 10 months later, the State Department came back to us very sheepishly and said, you know, we've discovered another universe of documents. And we said, well, what universe is this? What did you not see before? And that's when they revealed Mrs. Clinton was running her own outside server and sending all of her communications across it. And so that caused us to go back to the court and have the case reopened, which is extraordinary. The State Department admitted on the record that they had essentially perpetuated the fraud on the court. They had made misrepresentations. And that really was sort of the ignition point for where we now find ourselves years later.
From New York, in Amsterdam, New York, Joseph, Democrats line, hi.
Hi, I'm glad to see we're relitigating Hillary's emails instead of talking about children being held captive on the border. I'm really disappointed that C-SPAN didn't see fit to ask the opinions of Democrats concerning the border policy. Is it that they don't matter?
No, caller, I'll stop you there. 2 days ago, we addressed this with everybody. We wanted to address Republicans today. That was our last segment. What question do you have for our guest now?
Well, how about Democrats only? But let's keep going on this Judicial Watch thing. You know, they've spent $20 million investigating Hillary's email. And they don't seem to think that the collusion with Russia, all these Russian meetings that were lied about in Congress, we never met with them. Well, we did. I just forgot to put it down. Those don't matter. We need to relitigate Hillary's emails because that seems to be the most important issue to these guys. They don't seem to care about our border policy or anything else.
We'll leave it there. What about his argument? Why make light of this now? Why keep continuing down this track?
Well, there's been documented misconduct. I mean, arguably, and I could make the case pretty strongly, there's been a violation of Title 18 of the U.S. Code, Section 242, which is deprivation of rights under color of law. That's the long expression for abuse of power. You have arguably a pretty strong case that very senior FBI officials attempted to steer a presidential election. There's unambiguous language. Strzok says, we'll stop it, meaning we'll stop the election of President Trump. Anybody who gets kind of wrapped up in the partisanship of this should just pause for a second and flip it around the other way. Suppose you had different candidates from different parties and very senior government officials at DOJ and FBI expressing themselves in no uncertain terms about what they wanted to accomplish. Essentially throwing an investigation on a national security crime because they didn't want to have that candidate in jeopardy because the notion of the other candidate being elected was unacceptable to them. This is very grave stuff. I mean, I've done some public speaking engagements where I've said, let's do a little thought experiment. Let's take the same caliber of persons at Department of Justice and FBI, same rank, authority, responsibility, that kind of strata. And just for a second, let's pause, lift them up out of the DOJ, slide them over to the Department of Defense, and drop them in, and say, go. When you do that thought experiment, you go from sort of a legal coup of some sort to something that we don't think about as being in our American history, where our military leadership would go to those lengths to suppress an investigation in one area, engage in misconduct in an effort to skew an election. This is extraordinary stuff, and it can't be overstated, I don't think.
Let's hear from Mark in Wilmington, Delaware, Republican line. Hi.
Hello, sir. Excuse me. Hello, gentlemen. I have a question, and it may be too simple. However, sometimes you can tell where a person is from. They can tell you something about them. Is Hillary Clinton from New York State or Arkansas, the state of Arkansas?
What's the point, caller?
Hillary Clinton is a real good name. It's too bad she couldn't have been our first lady U.S. president. That's just the way it worked out. I'd like our next U.S. president to be from Los Angeles.
Okay, let's go to another Mark. Mark is in Bensalem, Pennsylvania, Republican line. Hi.
Good morning. Good morning, Chris. I was wondering what your opinion was. I know you touched on it just briefly about the fact that when one or more people get together and conspire to overthrow a sitting president and also influence an election, isn't that a conspiracy or a coup d'etat? Why did the Inspector General kind of antiseptically treat this as just a bias when there's multiple people involved with this with the exact same plan? That's conspiracy. I think, and the fact that he didn't turn it over to for prosecution for any of these individuals is just appalling to me. And on top of that, why was Christopher Wray not asked why Peter Strzok is still employed at his agency with all this information? And how can we trust that he could oversee this this weeding out of these conflicted people? So I would really like to hear your opinion on these issues.
Yeah. The caller makes some excellent points. Again, I want to go back to this notion, not even a notion, it's documented, that these activities at the FBI and Department of Justice were being either coordinated, directed. There was some synchronization with the Obama White House. President Obama has been silent on this, and I don't think he's had any either press statements or availability concerning this issue. He had previously been on the record saying he had never emailed with Secretary Clinton. We now know that that's false, that he did. The IG report discusses that. I think it was Senator Hatch yesterday. Mr. Wray was trying to say, hey, look, these are just a few bad apples. It's unfortunate that some people stepped out of bounds. It doesn't reflect the larger FBI. And I think Mr. Hatch said, well, let's look at who the bad apples were. The director, the deputy director, the agent who was involved in the interview of General Flynn, the email investigation, and the launch of the Russia investigation. His girlfriend, who was a principal attorney in all three matters, advising the director. This is pretty grave stuff. This is not, one dirty agent in El Paso. This is the leadership of the premier law enforcement and intelligence service.
We have a bit of Chris Wray talking about
Sure.
that, how this could affect the FBI as a whole. Let me play it for you and we'll get your thoughts.
Sure.
The OIG's report makes clear that we have significant work to do. And as I said, we're going to learn from the report and be better as a result. At the same time, I want to emphasize that this report is focused on a specific set of events back in 2016 and a small number of FBI employees connected with those events. Mistakes made by those employees do not define our 37,000 men and women and the great work they do every day. Nothing in this report impugns the integrity of our workforce as a whole or the FBI as an institution. I want to be very clear with this committee about the FBI that I've been able to see up close every day in the 10 months since my confirmation hearing before you all.
Chris Farrell, how would you square with that assessment that he gives?
I think Director Wray is involved in damage control and defending and protecting the institution. I think it minimizes or in some way trivializes, diminishes the gravity of what he faces. I understand where he's coming from, and I understand sort of the passive voice, mistakes were made approach, but I don't think there is, look, there's got to be a level of honesty about what went on, and I know that he's inherited a tremendous problem that he has to fix, but minimizing it or talking about it like, gee, some people made some errors on a travel voucher, this is much more important, much graver than that.
This is Nikki in Rockaway Park, New York, Independent Line.
Hi. I'd like to say hi to Mr. Farrell, but Mr. Farrell, I was taught as a child to always consider the source of information that I was receiving. So I would like to know if you have a legal background, if you are an attorney. I would like to know if you have a particular conservative bent, who funds you. I would like to know your background before I can believe anything that you put out there. I was taught that I should consider the source of information. So I would like to know if you are an attorney or if you're merely a reporter with the name of director.
Okay.
And I'm going to tell you why, because I see so many people on television, talking heads, and they claim they're expert, a security analysis, and these people are like 21 years old and they have this ability. You are older. I would like to know what your background is, so I should believe what you are saying.
Okay, we'll let it tell me.
I am happy to provide you with information about my background. First of all, go to judicialwatch.org, and under our About Us section, you can read my full biography, my various experience, training, credentials. I'm a former intelligence officer. I was commissioned as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army in 1983. I was a special agent of Army counterintelligence, and then I also later cross-trained to be a clandestine human intelligence case officer. I have successfully prosecuted espionage cases, contributing via investigative work, and either through court means or through intelligence operations, successfully resolved 6 different espionage cases against the United States, principally at headquarters U.S. Army Europe. So I have a long background in the intelligence world and in the law enforcement world in that regard. I'm also an adjunct professor at George Mason University and teach a course on journalism law. I've been with Judicial Watch for 19 years. I've seen an awful lot of stuff in 19 years in Washington, D.C., particularly when it comes to government corruption. So go to the website. You can read my full bio. That's the thumbnail sketch version of it.
For all the things that were found in the report, there were also a list of recommendations. I'll just read you a couple and paraphrasing that. I just want you to get a sense of the tone of what they're recommending. One of the recommendations was that to develop guidelines on permitting a witness to attend a voluntary interview of another witness. I think this goes back to the interview with Hillary Clinton that was conducted. In certain instances, charging decisions should not be announced prior to discussion without the AG and others. I think that goes back to Jim Comey and what he announced about Hillary Clinton. And then it says FBI should assess if adequate training on employees about the proper use of text messages and instant messages should be done. What do you think at the end of the day about those, considering what was investigated, those recommendations?
And that goes to my point about this is a policy and procedure review. This is pretty weak stuff. You know, employees should be instructed about how to use text messages. That's hardly the point. I mean, they're missing, yes, that's a true thing. They should know how to use text messages properly. But what's the environment? What's the leadership? There's much graver questions here. Look, Mr. Comey, on his 5th of July briefing, did 2 things. You know, he overstepped his bounds grossly by making a decision that wasn't his to make. It was the Attorney General's to make. He invented an entirely new element of the crime of 18 U.S. Code Section 793F, which is the mishandling of classified information. He came up with this new standard and talked about intent. Intent is not an element of the crime. But he goes on and on discussing intent. And again, this is an effort to manufacture a result that was desired. The interview of Mrs. Clinton on the 2nd of July at FBI, my first question at that time was it a rights warning interview? So, as to the last caller, I've done this. If I'm a federal law enforcement officer and I believe that you've committed a crime, you're the subject of the inquiry, your device and your decision to establish that device is the essence of the investigation, I have to Mirandize you. There was no Miranda. There was no rights warning interview. David Kendall, Mrs. Clinton's attorney, very artfully turned what should have been a rights warning interview of a subject of an investigation, he turned it into a coffee and donut session, where people who had been granted immunity, who were witnesses, who also claimed to be Mrs. Clinton's attorney, these are all massive conflicts. They were all sitting in the room together. There's been nothing like this ever in the world of counterintelligence investigations with respect to mishandling classified information. It just doesn't happen.
Gregory in Missouri, Republican line, hi.
Hi there. Mr. Farrell, got a lot of respect for Judicial Watch.
Thank you, sir.
This is not checkers, it's chess. Let's start from the top. Had emails to the president. You've had Susan Rice involved. All kinds of DOJ heads. One got sequestered, not sequestered, but, well, penalized because he couldn't do what Congress was asking. This was a coup d'etat attempt. And I think that's the way they planned it, although I think the FBI people, they made quite a few mistakes. With emails, you can't be doing that, and they did it anyway. But I think they're going to squirm out of this one, I do think the Clinton email matter should be brought up again in fair time. But I'm not a Republican for no reason. I got it. It's a sense of right and wrong. If it was us doing it right now, as a Republicans, I'd still stay the same. So that's all I want. But I think this was a coup d'etat attempt because you got Clapper, you got Brennan, you got so many top heads.
Okay.
Even I think Valerie Jarrett.
Okay, Gregory, thanks.
I think one of the things that the Strzok, Page, Agent 1 and 5, that circle of people that we're talking about in the IG report, I think to a large degree there was this sort of belief, I think even more broadly in the media, there was this belief that Mrs. Clinton was a shoo-in, that then candidate Trump was sort of an outlier and it was impossible or unlikely that he would win. In which case, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about with respect to this IG report, frankly, never would have seen the light of day. But Mr. Trump did win. And now there's all this sort of wreckage that needs to be cleaned up and accounted for. And that's why you see kind of the situation that we're in now, because it's not going to go away.
The Democrats line from Brooklyn, New York. Robert, hello.
Yes, I just had several questions for Mr. Farrell with regard to his commentary on the leaks which were communicated by Rudolph Giuliani on Fox News, Judge Jeanine's show, regarding information he had received from the FBI field officers in New York that indicated that Hillary Clinton was about to become indicted, which greatly affected the election. That clearly was actions by FBI and had a direct impact on the election.
Mr. Farrell.
So I know that there's been discussion about leaks generally. I know in particular, Mr. Giuliani, there's been claims that either New York FBI or perhaps NYPD detectives working jointly with, because they have a very close relationship, that perhaps he obtained information. I don't have direct knowledge of that. I think generally there's been a lot of leaking, frankly, across the board. There's very selective leaks, whether it's out of the committees. I can think of instances where, people have claimed that Mr. Nunes was leaking, Mr. Schiff was leaking, certainly the Mueller investigation. So leaking is sadly, almost an art form in Washington, D.C. And when one person points a finger and says, aha, they're leaking, you can just, wait 10 seconds and you'll find out there's a leak in the other direction. I'm not excusing that. I'm not saying that that's good or right. I'm just saying when you're conducting sort of a post-mortem to say, well, what happened here and how did it happen? I think you're going to find a lot of leaks. I think it's another point that came up in the IG report related to this is the IG documented instances where several FBI agents and DOJ employees were taking sports tickets, going to dinner. There's a whole section of the report talking about not just leaking like the caller just talked about, but sort of a quid pro quo. Hey, listen, let's go to dinner, or I'm going to give you tickets to go watch the Nats, or whatever it is that was going on. That takes leaking to a whole nother level, because now they're receiving benefit for sort of trading information. That's another topic that Mr. Wray has to tackle. If that's the environment of the Washington FBI, the headquarters and the field office, we're in trouble.
Let's hear from one more call. This is Sandy, Portland, Oregon, Independent Line.
Yes, hello, good morning.
Good morning.
Hello, Mr. Farrell?
Hello, yes.
I do have a question for you. First of all, I'm very upset about this whole situation. I had a gut feeling this whole thing was a setup to begin with. And I want to know why Mueller is still investigating. What the heck is he investigating? I mean, the IG report shows that this whole thing was basically a coup d'etat and a big-time setup. I think they all need to be canned. And even Wray, I mean, I couldn't believe his testimony. it's like I am just totally flabbergasted over this.
Thank you, caller, Mr. Farrell.
The IG report, while not directly on topic with respect to Mr. Mueller and his investigation, purportedly there'll be another report on that. It certainly does touch on it. There's discussion of Strzok's involvement and Page's involvement on the Mueller team. So there is some bleed over. But I think when you look at the broader sort of pattern of conduct, these text messages are a window into the thinking, the behavior, the conduct. This is not just people spouting off. These are people who planned and then acted. And those text messages are an articulation of, hey, where are we going? What are we doing? And while not directly on point to Mueller, it certainly, I think, knocks out a foundation piece of the Mueller investigation, because you can see that it's a deliberate, contrived effort to delegitimize or destabilize what was the Trump campaign, then the Trump transition, then the Trump administration. And they're unabashedly aggressive about it. And so that, combined with the staffing decisions that Mr. Mueller has made with respect to the attorneys on his staff, of the 14 attorneys, I believe 9 are registered Democrats, something like, another half again have documented campaign contribution histories for either Mrs. Clinton or other Democratic candidates. There's only one gentleman, I believe, by the name of Quarles, who's a prolific donor. He's given something like $35,000 over the last 10 or 12 years. Of that, about $3,000 went to Republican candidates. So you can do an analysis of who the staff attorneys are for Mueller. They are very decidedly in one direction. And then you look at the Strzok Page stuff. When you put it all together, it's a mosaic, right? We don't have a perfect picture. We have components. When you put it all together, it raises many grave questions.
More about this topic is available at the judicialwatch.org website. Christopher Farrell serves as the Investigations and Research Director. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Patrick.
Coming up with the news of those children being held at the border, along the southern border, comes the question about how that experience will affect them. Joining us next to talk about that is Dr. Paul Spiegel with Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. We'll have that conversation next on Washington Journal.